Well, good day, and welcome to another edition of Crapper. This week with Mr. Shaun Hall. Greet the people, Shaun.
Good evening.
And Mr. Peter Turner.
Hi guys, good to be back.
And myself, Tim Appleton. Now, ever since 1776, when the Americans decided to stop paying their taxes, there's been a special relationship between the British and the Americans. I'm joking, of course, about taxes. For who could begrudge the Americans their revolution at this stage in the game? I think, but one of the more interesting corners of this special relationship occurred in the 1960s with the exchange of cultural information that was the rock and pop movement. Um, in Basically, what happened was that the British stole American folk and popular music and repackaged it and sold it back to the Americans, um, who I suppose, to be fair, then repackaged it and sold it back to us. So that's good. Now, I think what happened in the 60s in the British case is that we tend to associate pop and rock music with bands. Um, and with the American case, we tend to associate it, I think, more with solo artists. That's an interesting
Mm.
cultural story in itself. But also, there were obviously lots of great American bands, and who better to comment on them than three British guys? Um, and so tonight we'll be doing our top 10 American bands of all time, plus some honourable mentions. Now, I think before we begin, I'd like to just talk about criteria a bit. A couple of things I wanted to mention. So, as I say, no solo artists. That was sort of the brief. There might be some limit cases, but I mean, I don't think we'll be discussing, Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen at any length tonight, etc. I think another criterion that's important for me, at least, is that decided to include in my top 10 no genre stuff at all. Um, what do I mean by that? Well, for example, I'm a big fan of, as the guys know, I'm a big fan of Metallica. I've always loved Metallica, but they're not on my list. They're not on my top 10. And I think the reason why is because they don't, their music doesn't, even though they've sold lots of records, their music doesn't reach the level of universality that some of the other bands that I'm going to mention does. They could be great, but like theirs is a music that comes very clearly from a certain genre and relies on certain genre tropes, as everybody says these days. So you need to be into that sort of music to kind of appreciate it a little bit. And so I've kind of avoided that. Public Enemy might be another example. Great band, but very sort of quite specific in terms of genre, right? And then the final thing I think is that just to say that this is obviously subjective, what we're saying.
Mm.
I wouldn't quite describe it as opinion because I tend to think of opinions as being objective in the sense that they just objectively circulate. We are trying to do a sort of genuinely subjective analysis, with a rationale and everything. But obviously it's not objective, So, before people get angry because we haven't included, I don't know, like Boston or, Journey or whatever.
Yeah.
Obviously, we are speaking for ourselves to some
Mm.
extent. Now, how about you guys? Peter, before we begin, did you want to say anything about the exercise?
Before we talk about, oh, yeah, the exercise, of course. Yeah, I mean, this is just fascinating because I'm looking forward to this one more than anything else because I just think that it's so unpredictable. I mean, you can go and look, can't you? I think I actually had a look at some lists, 100 greatest. I was thinking, is there 100? greatest US bands. And I thought, well, I went to 50. And as I went down, I just disagreed with so many of them. I was thinking, and I just don't like a lot of them. And I thought, Christ, this is going to be really interesting to see what I haven't dug up. And also, of course, with our sort of vast, past of listening to things, records, CDs, and all that, I sort of raked my way through that as well. And I came to the conclusion that actually there's not many American bands I actually listen to when we talk about bands. But that is kind of the nub of the issue, I think, is that when I started turning to American things, they're generally solo artists. And, you've even got people like Tom Petty, by name, sounds like a solo artist, band. Bruce Springsteen, when did you ever see him playing solo? It's like that's the difficulty I've had, I think, is it's a band that just happens to have the name of a person in front of it. And how is that different to another, just a band, like you say, Metallica or something? Because that wasn't, the name of the lead singer. And I really struggled a bit with that. I tell you, but it's so interesting. I don't know what you guys are going to come up with, but you know, we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting how that is interesting so it's sociologically interesting, isn't it? That difference. I often wonder whether British people are sort of British men, because it's a male-dominated field, this isn't it? Whether they're given to being in gangs
Yeah,
in a way that Americans aren't. Americans tend to sort of like they have a sort of Protestant individualism, which is even stronger than the sort
mm.
of the British Protestant tradition.
Yeah.
Um, sh- who knows? Who knows? Sean, how was it for you putting this list together?
Yeah, it was quite a tricky one. I think my list is coloured by the fact that I tend to. It's quite 1960s heavy. Is all I'll say for me personally, because that's just what I tend to listen to, and I find that the most exciting decade of music. There's so much change going on, and I think there were, so many interesting angles. But I have included a couple that are a few that are not from that decade, and I've kind of basically shoehorned them in. So it was an interesting one. But when I actually got going, I actually found there were a lot of acts that probably I could have had a list number two, really. So there's quite a few in my also rans category.
Also Rands. Yeah, I got a few of those.
Okay, well, we'll get to them as the penultimate act of the episode. All right, good. Well, thanks, Sean. Okay, so look, let's start with our number 10, right? Sean, would you mind starting us off with this?
Well, this is one that I've included this because my wife basically said if you don't add this band, you've got a problem. And also, it's probably one of my elder brother Stephen's favorite American bands, but they're not really one of my favorite bands, and I don't know why that is, and I won't leave you in suspense anymore. It's the Eagles. Um, I- they're one of those sort of you know California bands that I don't know. I think they've got a lot of musical talent, and I think they've made some great tracks. You cannot deny that Hotel California is it's lasted through time. Another track that I picked out was Journey of the Sorcerer, which for English fans you might know as the theme tune to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Ah.
So I included that. But to be honest, they're not really one of my personal favourite groups, but I can't deny the sort of. I'm being very diplomatic because I know there are a lot of people's probably favourite band, um, but I think they are sort of culturally important in that 1970s, mid 70s era. So they go on there sort of by default. I mean, I'm sure they could be a number one in someone else's list, but I've stuck them there number 10.
All right, lovely. Of course, they had the biggest selling album of all time, I think. Um,
Well, I can't
get,
argue with.
yeah, guess which one? The Eagles' greatest hits.
Oh. Oh.
What's your favourite Beatles album? The best of the Beatles.
which which isn't actually an album, is
It's
it?
actually an album. It's a good joke though.
Yeah.
Um, all right, great. Well, that's nice. There's going to be a lot of that tonight, isn't there? I don't actually like this band, but they're going on the list. I can already tell. Um, I've got a couple of people on my list that I barely listen to, but I think that they're pretty good. Peter, your number 10, please.
So my number 10 is the Mamas and Papas. The spirit that comes off this band is just phenomenal. I mean, they're when I was sort of 16, I bought an acoustic guitar and I sort of started getting into realizing that whole sort of West Coast thing. And they just came across as such a beautiful group of people, and they don't seem faultless to me, really. They're a great band and some really good singles. Well, excellent singles, really. They sounded amazing in the studio, like nothing else, really. They were kind of like a beautiful sort of version of the Beach Boys in a way, weren't they? They just sounded great together, and they're sort of live also. They've got this kind of tingles factor to them, I think, and they did so much to promote bands at that time as well. They were a very giving group of people. And I think it's just the sheer joy they bring makes them irresistible to listen to. I think it's one of those bands no one's favorite band is the Mamas and Papas. I wouldn't have thought, but every time you hear them, you cannot help but just think, why don't I listen to this more often? Why? And it just makes you feel so good to hear them. I just think they're a real standout band from that whole, genre on the West Coast.
Right. Lovely. They're not on my list, and I completely forgot about them. But I love the Mamas and the Papas.
Yeah.
I'm not sure they would have made my list actually, but I think they are great. Great band. All right. Well, look. Let's without further ado. My number 10 is a band that is named after an animal, but misspelled. I think in homage to the Beatles. I think you know where I'm going. It's not. No, it's not the monkeys. It's the birds.
Oh, yeah.
Although I could have put the monkeys on the list. I really like the monkeys, but
Hmm.
anyway, I think the birds are better. Um, I think the thing about the birds is that I think they're probably one of the best American bands of the '60s. It's a bit controversial opening
Hmm.
comment. I think that they sort of created genres. That's the interesting thing about them. They sort of created folk rock, American folk rock, and they sort of created country rock. Um, at Sweetheart of the Rodeo, garage rock, as they say, you know, alternative rock, or indie, as we call it, um, raga rock.
Well, sorry, are you just listing genres?
Yeah, it's going to be like this for the next
No,
hour. No,
it's not even a genre.
for that one. But they did this sort of they were pioneers really. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think those first 6, 7 albums by them are basically really solid. They're all really solid. Listen, they went down a bit after that. But yeah, I think that no list. This is the kind of
Yeah.
rubbish comment that people. No list would be complete without no top 10 American bands list would be complete without the Birds. I think so. That's my number 10. All right, Sean, you're 9, if you will.
Yeah, well, my number 9 is The Doors. I
Oh,
really like the sound of The Doors. However, the reason I haven't put them higher is I find, as I've got older, I find Jim Morrison a bit excruciating as an artist. However, having said that, I think they're pretty influential. I like that sort of they're sort of a rock and roll band, but mixed with a sort of a jazz sound. You got that sort of jazz
hmm.
backbeat from John Densmore, and some interesting guitar work. I don't know who the bass player was in the Doors. Was it a session guy, or did they actually have
Didn't have a bass player, did they? Did they
Use the
just play
keys, didn't they?
keyboards? Play it on a keyboard. It's like Van de
record
Graaf generator.
Ray Manzarek, and I think they were great, and a bit of the soundtrack of Vietnam, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, my first memory of hearing the Doors was listening to a very crackly Radio Caroline broadcast, which was a sort of a pirate radio station back in the day, and hearing, Riders of the Storm in terrible medium
Mm.
wave, probably in a storm. Um, and that made a great impact on me. But I think Jim Morrison was a bit of a, is it fair to say, he was a bit of a prat as a human being? Sorry, I've said it, but so that's why I haven't put them any higher. But I kind of like the sound of the Doors, so and very influential.
I think Jim Morrison's a bit futuristic, isn't he, for that time? There's something about him that feels like he slipped from another era
Yeah.
into, you know what I mean? There's something about him is slightly different than anyone else at that
Yeah,
time.
the 19th century.
Yes.
It's great, great lyricist though.
Interesting.
Interesting.
The blue bus is calling us.
That's what I mean. You see, that's what I mean. Yeah, cold poetry.
Yeah. Uh, all right, good. Peter, you're number 9.
I did have the Doors on my list, but I didn't quite make it in the end. Number 9 for me is actually REM. Now, I tell you what, REM are probably the best proper indie rock band that they had in the 90s. They had some good singles, and those first couple of albums were really big sellers. They sort of crashed in with some great songs. I think part of it, as well as I think I've got a slight crush on Michael Stipe, like a man crush. I don't know if either of you get this, but I just sort of love him really, and I love his voice. And he draws me in every time I hear him. Something about it. There's that kind of fragility to him, but backed with some really good songs. I think it's a really potent mixture. And I think also Shiny Happy People, when you hear it, you think that is one of the probably one of the most well-known riffs of the 90s, actually. And it's a bit like There She Goes, over here with the Lars, the riff to that. A Shiny Happy People kind of had that as well, I think. But I think they were just kind of one of the best indie bands of the 90s when we just look at indie in the sense that we see indie music rather than the Seattle lot, which is a completely different thing. So my number 9 is REM.
Yeah, the American Smiths.
Yes. Well done.
Well done. Yeah, I've got this weird feeling that we're all piping in opinions from somewhere else.
Oh, weird this. This is weird.
Is anyone going to speak in their own voice at any point tonight? Okay. No, it's good. Yeah, I had to choose this band because... all right, good. Yes, that's interesting. We've had no one's... There's been no...
No.
Every band we've said so far has been different. All right.
Yeah.
Good. Now, my number 9... Shaun was talking about bands from different eras. On my list, I've got sort of all the eras represented a bit, actually, which surprised me. I wouldn't do that necessarily in the British case, but I would do it in the American case. I don't know what conclusion one can draw from that. My number 9 is the Strokes. Now, I think the Strokes are what Velvet Underground would have sounded like if they were good.
Yeah.
Right. I like the fact that they sort of invent their own aesthetic. I think they're completely unique. That vocal sound, that weird vocal sound, the fact that they do these very short songs. We'd had like quite a long period of people writing longer and longer songs, and then suddenly this band comes along that just does very short songs. In fact, they're so short that at the end of each one, if you notice on the first couple of albums, they just stop. They say, right, that's enough of that song. So that's I suppose that's the sort of punky, punky affectation. But I also think that there's, I like the fact that they've got lots of weird sounds and that they build it all with guitars. So it's almost like an interesting clash, like aesthetic clash there. And I think there's a sort of, I've put like a Bachian formalism. They use sequences and on the guitar, both on the guitars and on the voice, which just doesn't sound like anybody else, really. I think that Julian Casablancas is a kind of creative genius. I think that he's done not just the stuff in the Strokes, but some of his solo stuff is really great. I think he's got a really sort of unique approach. I was thinking, what's the antonym of prolific? That's the only thing, because the Strokes are not prolific at all, are
No.
they? I mean, the first two albums I think are brilliant, and after that you can sort of I can take it or leave it really. And I think there's lots of occasionally there's a really great song comes up either by the Strokes or by the Voids, which is Casablanca's other band, or on his solo album. But for the Strokes, I think it's just really you just have to listen to those first two albums. Very short
Yeah.
statements, because short songs, but kind of came out back to back. And I think of them as two parts of a whole, really. And I think that those in themselves are enough of a contribution to
Yeah.
popular music.
I think they are they handle the guitar very well, don't they? Those two guitars because they're both prominent, and it's the same thing. The Kings of Leon, the first two albums of theirs, I always found the blend of guitars was done so well, and it sort of gets away from the predictable, doesn't it? To become something really exciting, actually. Even though Julian Casablancas is such a great leader, it's just so full their sound, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, nobody plays the guitar anymore, do they? Or is
Well,
that not true? I mean, it doesn't feel like the guitar is a lead instrument in rock music anymore.
I think it's the core little synths have sort of taken over a bit certainly over here on the sort of indie front. The
Right.
lead singers generally tend to have one of those little keyboards, and
Hmm.
everything comes out of there, and they put their fingers on it, and stuff happens.
Is it like what's it called, monophonic? You can only do one note at a time.
No, they're all the notes C, just in different pitches.
But yeah, the interesting thing about the Strokes actually is that they made their guitars sound like keyboards, didn't they? At a certain point, so
Mm.
basically maybe they were like the transition band. I don't know.
Mm.
Um, all right,
Yeah.
good. Well, look, that's my 9. So let's go to 8 then. I'm having trouble counting down from 10 to 1. This is like being at the doctor's. Uh,
Yeah.
um, yeah, number 8, Sean.
I've got a title for the Strokes for a new album.
Mm.
Could be Breaststroke.
Breaststrokes.
Breaststroke.
Stokes.
You can make of that what you will. Because you see, I stopped listening to music after about 1993. So this I know
Oh,
nothing of these.
this is great. This is great.
Um, but they're good. I wanted to shoehorn in Jimi Hendrix, so I did. I put down the Band of Gypsies, who
Ah,
only made one live album. I thought he's got to be on there. He was such a phenomenon. And yeah, I mean, a short-lived group. This is a bit like on a previous one where I picked Blind Faith. So I've stuck
mm.
them in. Who only exist for one album over here. And of course, it was his army buddies really, Billy Cox on bass and Buddy Miles on drums, who is a really completely different drummer from
Yeah,
Mitch Mitchell. I mean, actually, he could sing and play though.
yeah,
That's one
good. Good
thing.
singer.
But a bit more, I suppose, a bit more funky, a bit more R&B mixed with the sort of psychedelic sound. So, the live album went to number 10 in the UK and US, and I think it is a lot of modern musicians actually would, I say modern slash, has said that he likes this album, Lenny Kravitz, and some hip hop sort of people as well have cited this as an influence. I mean, the only song I really know is Machine Gun. That's the one that gets played, isn't it? Quite a bit. But I thought he's got to be on there. So I put him on there.
This is the thing. The comments are going to be crying out to him for this because of course, I would have put Jimi Hendrix on there, but I assumed he was a solo act, so I just sort of parked it. He's not even on an also ran.
Yeah, right.
Mm.
Maybe we'll come back to this in the also rans list. Yeah, that's a nice choice. I like the way Sean says various hip hop artists have cited it. I feel like saying, right, name one.
Yeah.
you don't know any of them, do you?
Jazzy Jeff,
Oh,
DJ
right.
Jazzy Jeff.
All
You'd
right.
have to come up. You'd have to come up with humorous ones on the spot.
DJ Sam Small, wasn't it? Sam Smalls?
Yeah.
I don't. I can't name any.
Yeah,
All
and
right. Good.
there it is.
Well, look. Let's go to. Thanks for that, Sean. Let's go. To I don't know to what extent I'm supposed to be moderating this. Okay, let's go to Peter, number 8.
Okay, this is just impossible, this conversation, isn't it? But my number 8 is Metallica. I think
Right.
the thing is about Metallica is they changed the whole scene in terms of like the metal scene or whatever you want to call that sort of LA thing at the time. They basically saw the LA scene for what it was, which was really awful, wasn't it? There was more hairspray. I mean, you could die of hairspray poisoning at that point if you went into one of those clubs. They changed it. They stuck to their guns. They did something about it. And those first, well, Ride the Lightning, I love, and then the Master of Puppets is a great album. I just think they're sort of genre defining band, aren't they? And everything sort of comes after it, but they really made the shift, into that style, which is brilliant. I think they sort of sat alone, and spawned so many other bands. I have to say, I'm not someone who would listen to Metallica a lot because I just find that it's too intense. You can't. I mean, I don't know if it's our age. It could quite possibly be that, but I can only take so much of it. But I always really appreciate it, and that I just think the recordings are just, if you get it on a decent, hi-fi and listen to it properly loud, I mean, they just sound phenomenal. Their recordings have just got better and better. Not necessarily the material, but the actual recordings are just like amazing. The way the production of their albums are just incredible. So I think for me, they had to slip into number 8. They had to get in there somewhere, but my God, ordering this slot is impossible.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like once again, I have the impression that we're channeling opinions from somewhere else. But well, are we speaking in our own voice here? But I think like I'm because I like thrash metal. So like there's so many American genre bands that I like. That's why I didn't even include Metallica because I love Metallica, but I also like Anthrax, and Slayer and Megadeth and Suicidal Tendencies. I think great, but I can't do like top 10 thrash metal bands.
Well,
Maybe that'd be another idea for an episode. Yeah. All right, good. But yeah, I mean, I think of all those bands, Metallica is the one perhaps. So perhaps I should have put them on the list. All right, good. Well, at my number 8, is that right? We're on 8 now. Correct me if I get the numbers wrong. My number 8 is. Bear with me, Frank Zappa and the Mothers. Right?
here we go.
Here we go. Right, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Now, the thing is that obviously you could say, well, Frank Zappa's a solo artist, but he's not really a solo artist in the sense that he writes most of the stuff, but the band is doing a lot of work. I think. And if he wasn't so famously an impresario, Frank Zappa, he would just be the key songwriter in one of the great American bands, which is the Mothers of Invention. I particularly think that the early phase, the first phase, the 60s phase, let's say, of the Mothers of Invention, I think that, the band have got real personality, and they're putting they've got a lot of imprint on the music, right? So I think that run from Freak Out, Absolutely Free, we're only in it for the money. What else is there? Lumpy Gravy, Uncle Meat, Weasels Ripped My Flesh, and Burnt Weenie Sandwich. They're all brilliant, basically, and he's using a sort of similar array of musicians. By the way, I think Absolutely Free is one of the best albums of the 60s. It's my personal favourite of that from that period, although I do really like Lumpy Gravy as well, and actually Burnt Weenie Sandwich is brilliant as well, I think. I mean, what can you say about this band? I mean, I don't really. It's difficult to know, isn't it? They're just sort of the maddest American band ever, I think.
Yeah.
Extremely eclectic. They're sort of mixing like classicism and modernism and postmodernism, and I suppose that postmodernism would be perhaps the over-determining feature there because postmodernism mixes things, right? I think they're probably the most technically proficient band in history, rock band. And I really like the comedy element. I love the satire. It's sort of a bit South Parky in the sense that they're just making fun of everything and everybody. So I suppose you could accuse them of cynicism, but I think the comedy is the more important element, actually. As Zappa himself said, does humor belong in music? And I think that really he proved that it does, or that it could have a
Yeah.
belonging in music. I sometimes also think that they're a bit like I sometimes think they're a bit like the Beach Boys, but dissonant, right? Which is one of the one of the interesting like connections that I make in my head. Well, it's interesting to me anyway. So yeah, that's my number eight. Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Go
Oh
figure.
God.
I know we're all over the place, aren't we?
We haven't repeated ourselves yet, which is good.
Astonishing. Sean, you're number seven.
Well, I think I'm about to break that rule. I've got the monkeys. Have we had the monkeys?
No.
No.
Oh, oh well. Yeah, I know they're a manufactured band and everything, but I think in Britain we loved them, and culturally I think they were on TV all the time over here,
Mm.
endless reruns through my childhood, certainly. And I know they're accused of being Beatles imitators and didn't write their own songs, and Paul McCartney didn't like them, but they were part of the 60s, and they were great value. They had a great sense of humor. um they eventually did try to break out of that sort of performing straitjacket, didn't they? By trying to release an album of their own songs. They released the film and the album Head, which sort of bombed, didn't it? But they had that wonderful uh song, Porpoise Song, didn't they? I think Mike Nesmith sort of showed a bit of talent as a country rock musician. I think he had the single "Listen to the Band" and had a sort of a solo career. But you know, I think maybe certainly important to me. I think the Monkees, they were a very early sort of memory for me. So yeah, I've put them on there quite high, but number seven.
All right, good choice. Yeah, I love the Monkeys. No, I mean I'm not being sarcastic. I
Mm.
think they're great. I mean the thing is that they didn't write all of their songs, but the thing is neither did the Birds. You know, and so this sort of idea of interpretation of like popular songs, written by the great songwriters of the day is not such a bad sort of aspect. All right, great. Peter, seven.
Sorry. So sorry, I'm back. So yeah, God, this is good because this is all unique and different. My number seven is actually Green Day. Now, I think my list is actually quite 90s. About half of it, I think, is stuff from the 90s. And Green Day sort of came out early, sort of very late 80s, I think, early 90s. But they're one of those bands that you either love them or hate them, I think. They're a bit like that. But what I've realized, having listened to them for a while now, is that they are very good at turning out the same stuff over and over again. Yet every song seems to be distinctive, and most of them bangers, as we call them over here. There's a relentlessness about them, which is really like you'd expect less from them, but you actually get more. And I think that's quite an achievement, really. I really liked American Idiot, which I know about 2001, 2002, something like that, which is an example of a kind of punk rock progressive rock kind of concept album, which I really like the idea of that. The first sort of six tracks are run through, all link up, tell the story of someone sort of, disconnected to their environment, leaving home, goes away to the war, the Iraq War. So it's a whole comment on that kind of thing, and then returns home and ends up marrying, the same girl that he dissed at the start, And I think I love a concept album, any stories. I love all that sort of stuff, and they do it so well. 21st Century Breakdown, I think, was a really good album as well. Around about that time, they had a really good run between about 2000, 2010. So I think they're quite an American band. Don't hear much about them over here, really, and certainly not recently. But I just think they're amazing for that consistency and an achievement of a style they never veered away from, and yet a bit like AC/DC, really managed to pull it off, actually. So number seven for me.
Very interesting. Sean, are they on your list? Green Day?
They aren't, but my son's heard of them, and I think a lot of his friends, sort of 12, 13, 14, they certainly like Green Day, but no, that's sort of one of those bands I missed out on for some reason in my sort of period from mid 1993 where I just stopped listening to music, and it
I
was
love the
just
idea of it being 93.
that was the cut off. I don't know why.
Yeah,
Yeah,
something happened in 1993.
met us.
We won't go into it. All right, great. Very interesting. We have not mentioned any of the same bands yet.
No.
And that's not going to change now because my number seven is the Killers.
Yeah, I thought you'd say that.
Yeah. Now I love the Killers. I mean, I know they're not cool. You know, I know they're not hip, but I think brilliant, and I think that they're incredibly underrated. Ironically, because they haven't done badly. I think Brandon Flowers is one of the best sort of pop songwriters working today. Um, I almost feel like it sounds like I'm joking, but I actually I do mean that. I mean, I just love the Killers albums. The first four I think are amazing, and I think that they build up to actually it builds up to the fourth one, which is called Battleborn, which I think is a masterpiece. I think it's one of the best American albums, certainly of the new millennium. People didn't like that one as much. I don't know why. It wasn't so critically well received. But I mean, what does that mean? Nothing. I think that they went off a bit after that. The album after that is not as good, and I think Imploding the Mirage is a pretty good set. And I think what's the one they did? They did another one after Pressure Machine, which I thought was basically shite. And they were going to do another album, but they've kind of abandoned it, and they've released some of the tracks that were going to be on it as singles, and they're all amazing. They seem to have lost interest in making albums now, and I think that they are sort of almost becoming a singles band. And they are, I mean, there's no one better as a singles band, but of course that doesn't hold my interest as much because I'm an albums
Yeah.
nerd. Um, but I think, yeah, even like Brandon Flowers' solo albums have got amazing songs on. I mean, there's this song Crossfire, I think it's called, which is just one of the best pop songs ever written. I think there's a. I promised myself I wasn't going to do any Tim's Pedantry Corner tonight because time's limited. But allow me this. The French have this concept of jouissance, which is difficult to translate into English. But what it means is like something like enjoyment. But the nuance is that it's enjoyment that's so pleasurable that it's actually painful. And that's the sort of the experience you get with a lot of great art, where it's sort of fascinatingly good, but it hurts your soul because it's so good. And I get that a lot with the Killers. They've done so much music that moves me, and sometimes it moves me to tears actually. And I don't know whether it's very unusual that. And it could be that there's an element of romanticism in it, but I also think that it's just like the creative act that they have achieved so many times over and over again is just incredibly moving to me. And I think that, I mean, that he's a Mormon, right, Brandon Flowers, and there's a sort of religious air to the to the way that they work.
It should be.
And the products. Yeah, so the artistic products, as it were. So, I think I don't know whether that's got anything to do with it, but anyway, I just love them, and I've talked way too long about them. Let's move on then to number six. So, Sean, you're six.
Okay. Yeah, I've got Buffalo Springfield at number six. Again, I think they're part of the sort of the anti-Vietnam sort of soundtrack, the counterculture, and it's sort of the appearance of well, this is the problem. Should they be on there? Because you got Neil Young in there, so you've got a Canadian American
Mm.
crossover. Stephen Stills. They're known for What It's Worth, Mr. Cell, Hello. Um, yeah, I really like them. I mean, they're only around for sort of a brief period, really, sort of 66 to 68, but I think they left quite a mark. So I've got them at number six.
What I think is funny is that this is like a funnel, isn't it? We start out wide and anything goes, but I reckon we're going to get to a point where we're going to have some clash.
Well,
Something's got to come up twice.
we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I love Buffalo Springfield. I they were edged out by the Birds on my list. So it's two slightly different
I
ways
was
to go there. I think.
I was going to say, Sean, the when Tim was talking about the Killers, I remember you saying you liked the stuff they did before 1993, but not
Yeah,
after.
yeah. No, after that, it just all went off.
Yeah.
I
Brilliant.
have heard of them, I have heard of
Yeah.
them. I'm not that much of a lummox, but
Um, all right. Good, Peter. Six, right?
Number six, good old RATM, Rage Against the Machine. Now, I mean, they were a real bombshell, like no one had heard anything like this. This rap and rock thing. It seems so obvious, doesn't it, when it's done? You just think, like looking back because we were actually around and we were like, 21 or something at the time. It seems so obvious, doesn't it, to us? But it didn't actually exist before then. That was a new thing at the time. Such an obvious thing to do. Rap had a big like boom in the States, in it, sort of mid to late 80s. And you've got this sort of rock element comes in. They put it all together, and you have this fantastic sound alongside the politics and the technicality of Tom Morello, sorry, his playing, which was just wonderful, trying to work out what the hell he was doing and seeing them live. I actually saw them at Glastonbury that year in '94 when the album came out. It's amazing. The debut was so listenable. I mean, it was just from beginning to end. It's one of those great albums that you just, when you hear it and you're young, it's just brilliant. You just love it. Absolutely love it. And it still lives with me now. They knew how to keep things simple. They were hell bent on making sure that the sounds were realistic and could be reproduced live. I think that fell apart a little bit maybe after the second album, but those two good albums, just I think they're brilliant. The first two definitely, and then after that they kind of go off keel a little bit. But I just think they were just such a flash, wonderful moment in their sort of genealogy of rock. I think it's wonderful.
All right, great. We've got a perfect run of no repeats so far.
That's a lot.
Yeah. Uh,
15 bands.
yeah. All right, good. And now my number six is Blondie. You remember Blondie?
Yeah.
Um, I'm not quite sure what to say about them. I just think that they're brilliant. I think they're one of the best American bands of all time. I think it's kind of appropriate that Debbie Harry was in. Somehow feels appropriate that Debbie Harry was in a Andy Warhol print
Yeah.
because pop art. I mean, I think Blondie are sort of art pop, really. Um, they bring a sort of artistic sensibility to a popular music form because a lot of their stuff is sort of pastiches. But I think if you're just doing pastiche, it can sort of fall flat. But I think they're doing it with real affection and love. So there's a sort of they're sort of a bit punky at the beginning, but they're kind of recreating a lot of the uh, late sort of early '60s stuff, really,
Mm.
the girl group stuff. Excuse me, in the same way that the Smiths were doing actually slightly later on. It's sort of like harking back to the tradition of girl groups and things like that. I'm not just saying that because Debbie Harry is a girl, but like it's the sound and the way that they're writing as well. But yeah, I think they're sort of incredibly stylish, but very intelligent. But like, if that's not a weird thing to say, but stylish and in a good way. And yeah, I just think the first sort of five albums are basically brilliant. I think the outstanding masterpiece is Parallel Lines, which I think is one of the best rock albums ever made. It's flawless. And I think it actually they were sort of building up to that, and then after that they found it slightly different. That was the peak, really. Like almost literally the sort of mountainous sense, and they actually found it difficult to repeat. Although Eat to the Beat is also a great, really great album, very consistent. But once you've made the perfect album, what do you do? This is the Pink Floyd dilemma, isn't it, with Dark Side of the Moon, at least
Yes.
according to Pink Floyd themselves.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my number six, Blondie. Okay, Sean, five.
And say good drummer who sadly died
Yeah,
recently.
we've just lost Clem Burke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Shame. Um, well, my number five. Now, I had to put this one in because my son said he'd kill me. And this is where I have veered radically into the modern era, and I've put Nirvana, and not the '60s version of Nirvana. Uh,
Yeah.
and I was there. I remember Nirvana. I can remember being at art college at Thurrock Tech, and a guy, we used to hand out cassette tapes, didn't we? Sort of
Yeah.
these mix tapes, and mine would have sort of Hawkwind, Sid Barrett, and Yes. Uh, Terrible mixture, really. Not much different to today. And somebody passed me oh, you got to listen to this. It's grunge. It's grunge. And I thought, what's grunge? And it had all these sort of bands. It was the Sub Pop label, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So there was, I think, Soundgarden and Mudhoney and all these sort of groups, and obviously one of them was Nirvana, and I just remember the excitement when they broke, and I can remember a couple of peers at art school saying, "This is it, this is the music for our generation," just like that. And the weird thing is the way Nirvana dressed. I used to shop in a shop in a local town of Brentwood called Millets, and it was all you'd buy a pair of jeans and a lumber shirt, because it was sort of cheap, and it just so happened, all these people are wearing the same clothes as me. What's going on,
Yeah.
And it was bizarre, really. And but I digress. But I think they were a great band, and they sort of married sort of punk rock with sort of Beatles, almost Beatles-esque style songwriting, and I think it's no. Um, they were sort of a cut above all their peers. I think they had something going on that the others maybe didn't, and that's why they're held in such high regard. Maybe they could just write good songs. Basically, that's what I'm trying to say. And my son who's 13, him and his mate, they absolutely love Nirvana. That I guess it must be like the Beatles in a way for
Yeah.
them. And there's kids walking around still with Nirvana
Yeah.
t-shirt
Yeah.
on. And it's funny, but I don't really personally listen to them an awful lot now. I find it puts my blood pressure up, some of the music, you know. And but I think that they're a great band, and I think I've still got the first album. Was it Bleach? I think I've got that on vinyl
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
Out. Yeah, not a band I tend to listen to, but I think they're very, very culturally important export to the UK.
You have Bleach on vinyl.
Vinyl, yes, yeah.
Wow. I don't think many people over here would have had it on vinyl, actually.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Do you
got a
get it?
bit.
Do you get it in a car boot sale?
I think it was our price actually. And it didn't. I don't think it was very expensive. It was probably about 2.99.
Their third album came out in 1993. Does that include you or
I
not?
started going off that then. I started going off. Yeah.
By the way, I think Sean, that was your allotted one anecdote per episode. I
Yeah.
think we need a jingle. We need a jingle for the podcast version. Sean's anecdotes. All right, great. Well, listen, before we go to Peter, because we're expecting Mr. Turner's number five any second now.
Mm.
I'd like to cut in, if I may, and go first because my number five is Nirvana.
Oh,
So we've got our first, meeting of minds here,
Yeah.
and so maybe I'll do my five now, since we're on the subject of Nirvana. I think that I remember. Well, I'm going to do an anecdote. Why not? I just remembered. One day in 1994, I went round to see Peter, of all people. I think we were playing our guitars. We were at college at the time, and I arrived first thing in the morning. And the door was answered by Justine Greenfield. I don't know if you remember Justine, our friend Justine. First thing she said to me was, Kurt Cobain's dead.
Oh yes.
So that gives you an idea of how big they were, like to our generation. Maybe it's because we were at college at the time, but even though we're not Americans, like they really meant something, didn't they, Nirvana?
Mm.
Um, now, why did he die? Why did he kill himself? I mean, I think that you could give a whole series of explanations for it, right? Psychologistic explanations. He was on drugs, he was depressed, whatever. But I think you can also do. Um, I think you can also do a sort of structuralist reading of it. That's to say that he killed himself because he realised that he'd reached the end of a sort of creative cycle. You know, I don't mean that to sound flippant, but I mean structures do exist. And they do affect people's lives. And I think that in a sense, I think In Utero, which is their last album, is my favourite of their albums, is in a sense is the synthesis of Bleach and Nevermind. So I think he'd kind of reached the end of a certain creative arc there. And I think that does play on the minds of people like Kurt Cobain, who are very artistically sensitive. I'm not offering this as an explanation, but I just think it's like one possible reading of what happened.
Mm.
He reminds me, yeah. I mean, it's funny you should mention the Beatles, Sean. He reminds me of John Lennon a bit, Kurt Cobain. A similar sort of creative attitude, and of course, primal scream therapy. I mean, there's a scream therapy, isn't there, in Nirvana, which is
Yeah.
sort of evocative of, it sort of echoes Plastic Ono Band and things like that. So yeah, and there's a sort of tunefulness in amongst all the grunge and the punk angst and all that stuff. But yeah, again, a bit like you, Sean. They're not constantly on my playlist, but I do think they're very, very important. Thanks to Mr. Kurt Cobain. It wouldn't it be funny if Peter's number five was Nirvana? I doubt it will be, but let's see. What is your five, Peter?
No, it's not. He's in there. But no, my number five is actually Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. Four solo acts, refugees coming together. Basically, they give me the kind of chills in the same way that the Mamas and Papas do. And their harmonies are so good. I mean, seriously, those guys sound amazing, don't they? When they put it together, it's the Hollies effect, but with an extra dimension, like the Beatles had two, didn't they? The Hollies sort of had three. And then all of them harmonizing just sounds incredible. It's a masterful blend of sort of new age folk, I think is what it is. It's kind of a new way of doing things alongside the sort of rockier stuff as well. They sound superb. I mean, they're brilliant musicians as well. I mean, really good. And, hearing any of them live at that sort of late 60s, early 70s, it's just really flawless, isn't it? Their sound. And I think, it's just they're a wonderful example of what came out of the West Coast, I think, and just kind of created these other ways of writing, and these other things that were possible, to do. And that whole sort of bed of artists just was a wonderful thing, I think. And they're sort of up there with the cream, I think.
Right, very good. I can see patterns are going to start to emerge at this point. Okay, number four, Sean.
Oh, is it me? It's
It's
me.
you now. Sorry,
You
yeah.
are Sean.
Yeah, I am. Well, being a sort of an ex retired drummer, my number four is Santana because I think they're a very sort of drummerly band, and I think they're a very exciting band. I think they're the sort of band that you would enjoy a lot more, perhaps live. Um, but it's a tenuous one because he's actually Mexican, isn't he, Carlos Santana? So, but a mix there over the border. He crossed over the border. Wouldn't be allowed now, would it? But he did it then. And I think probably the first few albums, Santana 1969, Abraxas, and the imaginatively titled Santana 3 were all sort of critically acclaimed at the time. You got that great songs. You got Oh Yeah, Come Over, Samba Party, and of course they've got Black Magic Woman. But I think they're quite an influential group at that time. Um, One of the best-selling groups of all time, and I think even Phil Collins of Genesis was quite influenced by them on tracks like "Dance on a Volcano," from Trick of a Tail. You wouldn't expect Genesis to be at that period in the mid
No.
'70s to have sort of such an influence, but I think they're a great band, and occasionally I'll dig them out and tap along with my knife and fork.
They're one of the highlights of the Woodstock film as well. It's like genuinely exciting to see them
Yeah,
play.
Yeah, that's right. They're one of the only bands that sound good on that film, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah,
And the drum solo is unforgettable.
brilliant. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Um, all right, good. So, Peter, you're number four.
So this is sort of stretching the this. I think I've done quite well band wise. I have to say, no solo acts, any of that stuff. But I had to put Simon and Garfunkel actually as number four, which I know is a duo. But they sort of grew, didn't they? They sort of grew through the 60s, and they're unrecognizable. If you go back to the sort of, I don't know, 63, 64 Sound of Silence about that time. Am I thinking of the right one? Maybe not. When the first album, anyway,
Oh,
Wednesday
Wednesday
morning.
morning, 3 a.m. Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of 63, maybe that was that sort of era. It's a completely different world to, the Bridge Over Troubled Water by the end. I mean, what can you say apart from the songs are so good, really, really good songs. He's just an instinctive songwriter. If you ever seen Paul Simon in an interview, he's he's almost like slow to the point of like he's not in the room sometimes. You think, oh, this guy is obviously a really like deep thinker, or he just doesn't care what anyone thinks. He hasn't had a particularly nice life. He's had a lot of failed relationships, but he seems just somehow just sort of cruises through it in some way. But songwriting is just magnificent. I know that Paul Simon did a lot of good stuff afterwards, but you cannot take away that progress from Wednesday morning right through to Bridge Over Troubled Water is amazing. So could have been left off the list as a duo, but I felt a bit like it kind of gets a bit band-like, doesn't it? They knew, I think, whoever produced them, I think it was the same one at Columbia as Dylan had, wasn't it? He obviously saw what was happening, which is you need a band. You can't carry on as you are, just the duo. So they started putting rhythms in and things, but it did them no harm. However, if you want to hear how great they are as a duo, my God, there's some wonderful live recordings, like the college sort of stuff they did, the duos. There's nothing like it. And I'm a huge fan of the Everleys, and that's pretty much like what they wanted to be. I mean, the Everleys, huge influence. But I think that's what they wanted to be, but they do it with such class. They sound amazing. And they did those sort of solo tours, in 67, 68. Amazing. Really amazing.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because like you say, well, they're not. Are they really a band? But then on the other hand, if they're not, they're not a solo artist either.
No.
So they're closer to being a band than being a solo artist.
Yeah.
I think. Um, yeah. So all right, good. Now my number four next is Fleetwood Mac, which is hilarious because Fleetwood Mac can fit on any ranking, 60s, 70s, 80s,
UK.
UK, US, they're like a wild card that you can just throw in. But I think they particularly deserve a place on this list, because I think that that sequence from 75 through to 87 was the American. I think of it as the American sequence. In fact, it started slightly earlier than that, but I don't like the stuff so much before that. But when Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks join, I think that they really go up a gear, and they're both Americans, and I think that they had a really big effect on the band. I mean, to be fair to the others, they also inspired Christine McVie to do some of her best work, and to be fair to the rhythm section. It was Mick Fleetwood's initiative, wasn't it? The whole thing, he got them in, Famously, Lindsey Buckingham, would you like to join the Fleetwood Mac? I will if you'll invite my
Yeah.
girlfriend to join as well, Stevie Nicks. But actually, Stevie Nicks turned out to be, I think, the best songwriter of all of them. And I say that without any irony whatsoever. They sort of treated her as if she was like the sort of junior partner. But actually, I think her stuff is more consistent than anybody else's. I think I've made that case in a previous video. Yeah, so I think they're okay. So they're a pop band, but I think that pop doesn't get any better than this, really. When you read through, like from the Fleetwood Mac album '75, Rumors, Tusk, Mirage, Tango in the Night. When you read through the track list, and they're all contributing sort of by turns. They're just full of nuggety goodness, aren't they? And it fills you with real confidence. Just reading the track list, it's like this is one great track after another, and they just did it over and over again. And yeah, I think that's all I can really say about them. I'm always impressed when people have enough humility to commit themselves to the group dynamic and they don't flounce off. And they really did. They did that for long enough. They managed to
Yeah.
work. They managed to keep the tensions down, in spite of
Yeah.
all the rumors. They managed to keep the tension, in check long enough to do a great series, a really great, almost unmatched series of pop albums. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's my number four.
Because they're when you look back, I mean, it's like they had real perspective, didn't they? Because when you look back on it, you think, my God, well done for sticking it out. Because look what came of that. But at the time, God, it must have been so easy just to walk.
Yeah.
Really, they could have done. But you look back and you think, yeah, that's like perspective in it. This is what's making the band work. Just stick at it, do it. And it worked
Right.
brilliantly.
Yes, I mean there's a lesson there. I think. I don't know
For other
what.
bands, yeah.
Um, all right, great. Well, so let's go to. We're going to getting into the top three now. So, Sean, would you kick it off?
Well, on the subject of Fleetwood Mac, I saw them in 1987, I think it was, or
Ah,
88.
that was before the '93
Uh,
watershed.
And Lindsey Buckingham had left, and they had, I think it was Rick Danko and Billy Burnett, and they were on an all-day uh, gig during the day. It was at Wembley, the old
mm,
Wembley Stadium, and Jethro Tull were on the bill. So
Wow.
see them. But yeah, the highlight was Mick Fleetwood came out. He did a sort of drum solo, and he was dressed as a sort of, I don't know, would you say it's Regency period? He
yeah,
had
he's a bit like that, isn't he?
slightly like that. And he used drum solo, and he had these pads on his body, and he came out and he was doing that. And for me, I can never forget that or get that out of my memory.
Can't get the image out of your head.
Yeah.
My favourite image of Mick Fleetwood is of him presenting the Brits with Samantha Fox
Oh my
with the with
God.
the with the dodgy auto cue.
Awful.
Brilliant, wasn't it? That was brilliant. But yeah,
Anyway,
good band. Well, I'm afraid I have overlapped. I've put Crosby, Stills. No, is it Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young? They're all kind.
Crosby and Stills.
and Nash and Young.
Oh dear, yeah. So really, one of the first supergroups, aren't they? And you've said it all, Peter. Really, it's the harmonies are amazing, aren't they? And yeah, what can I say about them? Really, I think Neil Young turned up at Woodstock, didn't he? That's when he sort of appeared with them. But they're just a band that will be on rotation, on my playlist, and quite happy when one of their songs appears. It's sort of a joy to listen to. But yeah, I mean, I should have put them higher. Number three.
Well, look, can we do, because this is curious. Can we skip the order again, Peter, with your permission?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Because my number three is Crosby and Stills and Nash and Young as
And Young.
well. Um, so might as well just keep talking about them, I suppose. I mean, I think that to me, they took up where the Birds left off. Really, a bit more progressive. See, there's continuity in my list,
Mm.
cultural continuity. I think I am aware that they're more of a metaphor than a band. Because they called it the mothership, didn't they? Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young. Um, but I think of them as sort of like almost like a hippie collective. You know, basically slightly living together, taking drugs together, sometimes flouncing off, sometimes coming back, sometimes punching each other because someone's stolen someone else's girlfriend. Um, and sometimes getting arrested for having an illegal firearm. I think that's the case in the case of David Crosby. Usual hippie stuff. Um, but I think that for me, it's difficult to separate. Obviously, they did two amazing albums, and only two, really. I mean, they did another one much later on, but it was awful. Um, but they did those two completely amazing albums. But then I find it difficult to separate the stuff that they did afterwards solo or in duos because they like Stills and Young had a band together, and Crosby and Nash did a couple of albums together, a few albums together. I find it difficult to separate that stuff from Crosby, Stills and Nash as such. So I kind of put it all together in my mind, which seems unfair, but it's all good, isn't it? As the Americans say, why not? And I often, as a sort of like thought experiment, I wonder what a third Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young album would have looked like. Because if you take like the best tracks from their first set of solo albums,
Mm.
Love the One You're With, Southern Man. What did David Crosby do? Well, Laughing is the track that was left off Deja Vu, the Lee Shore, stuff like that. And put that together.
Mm.
Chicago, that was the Graham Nash number. You put all that together, you would have had an awesome album. But again, they wanted to do separate stuff and that.
I think a lot of these good bands have their Black album, don't they? The
Yeah.
What Would Have Happened If.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that my comment on something that Sean was, I think, alluding to earlier was I don't think they should have invited Neil Young to join because
Mm.
I think he sort of exploded their dynamic a bit. He didn't
Right.
really want to be in a band. He's not a band sort of person. He is a solo artist.
Mm.
And he did some good stuff with Crosby, Stills, Nash. But the only thing that he really contributed that was classic was Helpless.
Mm.
And that's not even the best track on Deja Vu. And I don't really think they needed him. I think they sort of shunted him in there. And I
Yeah.
think he sort of exploded the band a bit. I mean, maybe I'm being unfair, but I don't really think that they needed him. But I think he is, I suppose, part of the mothership, it all said and done. So that takes us to Peter's number three.
Yeah.
Uh, go
Well,
for it.
look for the young people who are listening. Although I'm sure our audience are older. There was a time before the internet, and I think that this band are just at the cusp of that. And word of mouth isn't really a thing nowadays. It doesn't really work like that anymore. Everything is online. You don't have to hear anyone telling you something. But this album from The Strokes, who are my third number three. The first album is one of the only examples in my lifetime where things have one of the only, where you've literally heard about it kind of out of nowhere. And that first Strokes album was like a pre-MySpace thing. This wasn't even like, the Arctic Monkeys kind of stuff, which was, online. This is an album I heard about and I don't even know how I knew about it. Is This It? Their first album, 2001, I think maybe it was. It's just a phenomenon, the way it exploded. I don't know how I know about it, but what I do know is that Alex Turner of the Arctic Monkeys said on one of their recent albums, I just wanted to be one of the Strokes, which is the opening line of their album before last, I believe. Which is where they actually grew out of. I mean, this band, the Strokes, are a real back to basics sort of revisit, aren't they, of that Blondie era New York. It is a New York scene, isn't there? I mean, it's kind of different to other things. And they grew up out of that with this kind of punk sort of feel to it, but with 21st century, sensibilities. And I think they're just a great five piece. They like you said, Tim, the Bach kind of element comes in, doesn't it? Which is the notes, understanding the shifting of chords and how things can be blended. They really understand that. Very well arranged, simple songs, very catchy. They were a reminder, weren't they, of a time before. Um, they seem to have dropped out of another era, essentially, like a reminder. I think Oasis did that a little bit as well. They kind of reminded people of what had been. They're a bit like a sort of more serious Green Day in a way, but with a sort of more intelligent approach, I think, as well, and a different kind of feel. But they kind of got that vibe to them. There's a sort of endlessness almost about their sound, and that first album does feel sometimes like, is there any variation here? But there's endless variation. It's just on a theme, isn't it? They've just got a theme and they stick to that theme. So I think the Strokes were amazing, and I think it's one of the few examples of, where the hell how did word get around then? Because we weren't online, we weren't being told this stuff, but somehow I'd been told about it. Went to a party and someone said, "Oh yeah, have you heard it?" Then, like, where the hell are people hearing about this? But there it was being played. Amazing.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, they're curiously classical, aren't they? The Strokes. There's something
Yeah.
curiously classical about them,
Yeah.
and classic, I suppose, as well.
I think in a way, although they never got really, they exploded, but I'm not sure actually that they're big, are they? Not now. They were for a very short amount of time, but I think when people look back at the 2000 to maybe 2010, 20 era, they're one of the best bands America have had, but they need sort of almost rediscovering, I think, in the future. They'll need sort of digging up a bit.
Yeah. Right. Well said. Okay. Good. So now we're doing two. Right. We're on to two, and I think it's your turn, Sean.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't, as you know, I don't know an awful lot about the Strokes because it's post watershed for me. But if they wanted to do a compilation album, they could call it Brush Strokes.
I tell you what, a greatest hits would be bloody marvelous from them.
Yeah. Okay. So my number two is the Birds. I really love the Birds, and I'd still listen to them. Um, I think we haven't mentioned Roger McGuinn. Oh, McGuinn. It is
McGuinn.
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 Yeah, and he's sort of jangly Rickenbacker sound. His Rickenbacker guitar, which I think did it influence the Beatles or was it vice versa?
I think it
Um,
was vice versa.
yeah, it's sort of that mid 60s sound, and his rather unusual solo on 8 Miles High. I mean, who can forget that, which
Rather rock.
sounds to all the world, like he's just playing random notes, but it sort of works,
That's the raga bit.
Yeah.
the raga.
That's the raga rock bit.
Raga. I love that, and I like that album. To be honest, I think that's a smasher. I'm not so keen on when Crosby left. I don't know whether I really get into the sort of the country sound of the Birds, but I suppose they had Graham Parsons joined, didn't they? But I think they've influenced a lot of bands, and you can't deny that. I'd say. That sort of sound that somebody like Tom Petty or even REM, that sort of jangly guitar. Dare I say the Smiths? I mean, it's that sort of guitar sound that sort of was popularized around the 80s. It sort of made a comeback, but I really like the Birds. Good band.
I don't know if you've proved my earlier thesis that they were incredibly influential, but at least you've echoed it. I think
Yeah,
they were more influential than you might think.
yeah.
The Birds. Okay, very good. Okay, Peter, number two.
Yeah, number two for me is Nirvana. Um, the thing is, we can only see it from our perspective, can't we, from the UK? And I mean, what had happened was we in the UK there was a huge explosion of sort of pop music, like sickly kind of pop music. Some of it really good, some of it terrible, and it sort of steadily got worse as we went through the 80s. But out of that also came the sort of house scene. And you've got then lots of pop house, like The Only Way Is Up and things like this, which I guess you'll know in the States. And then we've got a sort of dying off of that, and the sort of house scene sort of dying off and becoming more sort of it's a sort of rave scene. And there's this kind of moment, I think, in about 1990 where basically almost nothing is happening of interest in the country, and then in 91, late 91, suddenly Nevermind comes out. And the kids, this is just perfect timing, especially for us, our age group as well. This is what we've been waiting for. And they came out that Seattle scene. I think Cobain, Kurt Cobain was the only one who could genuinely write something that was absolutely universal, that everyone really liked. There's a huge amount of bands, Sonic Youth, came out of that scene as well, but they just don't write in the way that he writes, and their success relies in sort of hitting the right tone with the young. And I think this doesn't happen very often, actually, where a generation gets captured by one idea and it's just a universal, it's across the world. And it sort of happened with Elvis, didn't it? It was just a unique new thing that could not be denied, that no one but we're talking then of a time, where it was just completely new, but you've got people like Dylan did it, just captured the voice of a generation. Then the Sex Pistols, I suppose, were kind of like an explosion of sudden difference. And I think in a way that was kind of what Nirvana did, was they sort of woke everything up again, it was like the rebirth of something. And I mean, if you're in any doubt about like how good they were, I mean, there's 1991, there's a DVD, a recording from the Paramount Theatre, it's called, in Seattle. And what they'd done is they'd become quite big. They'd gone away and recorded Nevermind, and it was about to be released. And then they do this concert, and it's properly recorded, really well done. It is incredible watch. It's so good. And I think the sad thing in a way is I think that actually is their peak. They sound so good. And then you just know the story of what's going to happen next, and it kind of everything starts to fall apart almost after that, after Nevermind comes out. However, I think all three albums do contain good songs. I mean, they do. There are good songs on those albums. You were saying, Tim, you prefer the last one. Nevermind is the one most people like, some people prefer Bleach, a different drummer, but different feel, really. But I don't think any of them's a masterpiece, though, I have to say. I think that there's a lot of good songs on each of them, but I don't think they ever really got an album that was absolutely spot on. Even with Nevermind, I think there's a few sort of duds in there. But I don't think often you get a band that come along that are so influential out of sort of nothing, really. And I think they just sort of captured something which will always live with me because of my age, probably.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you say. There's is an Oasis documentary, isn't there? Quite a famous Oasis documentary which came out a few years ago. Do you remember that? It's
Sonic.
Supersonic, that's right. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
It came out in cinemas and everything, and it was about the story ended with Nebworth, I think.
Yeah.
And what they were saying in the documentary, and I think even like Noel Gallagher probably said this, that this was the last time that everybody was all together around like a common event. And as you were saying, like there were scenes, weren't there, back then? And I think that this is probably pre-internet. That's why, really, internet fragmented everything, didn't it? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it is a different thing.
Very different. Yeah.
All right, great. Well, I think it's me now, isn't it? Number two. My number two is Simon and Garfunkel. Now, I think they are a band, minimally a band. Yeah. Paul Simon's obviously very important songwriter. I would say second only to Dylan, really, in terms of like the form of what he does in the 1960s. But I think that Art Garfunkel's contribution is important. There's a film, Judd Apatow comedy. I think it's called This Is 40, and I won't recount the whole plot. But there's a scene in it that I really enjoyed and I really remember. It made me laugh. Where it's about a married couple that are going through a crisis in their marriage, and the wife at one point accuses the husband. She said, "You're like Paul Simon and I'm Art Garfunkel, right?" And then there's a whole thing where like he has to interpret what that means. So the next day he goes to the bar and he's talking to his friend and he says, "She accused me of being Paul Simon to her Art Garfunkel." But he said, "But that's good, isn't it?" I mean, isn't it better to be Paul Simon, because he writes the songs? And his friend said, no, that's terrible. He says, Paul Simon writes a song. He said, anyone can write a song. He said, Art Garfunkel's got the voice of an angel, you know.
Yes.
And so they are minimally a band, I think, Simon and
Yeah.
Garfunkel. That's my point. And I think you're right, Peter, in what you said. I mean, I agree with everything you said, really, every word. They made like the perfect transition from folk artists to pop songwriters, really. No one did it better than them. Um, and I think they did never made a bad album. All 5 albums are completely amazing. And they wrote some of the greatest songs of the 60s, really. And the best of them, for my money, is the best album for my money, at least, is Bookends, which I think is
Mm.
one of the greatest albums ever made. I prefer it to Bridge Over Troubled Water, personally, because I think Bridge Over Troubled Water has got some brilliant songs on it, but like some of them are a bit weaker. And
Mm.
also, I love the opening track to Bridge Over Troubled Water, but when the pan pipes come in on track 2, I usually reach for the
The
for the
needle.
needle.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's my number 2, Simon and Garfunkel. Now, before we go to our number 1, let's do our also rans. Sean, who do you have on your list of also rans?
I've got quite an extensive list. I'd have loved to have put Simon and bloody Garfunkel, but I just thought they're a duo.
Mm.
I'd have had them
Yeah.
either 2 or 1, like you guys. Well, I'll canter through them. Talking Heads, um, the band, obviously Bob
Ah, but
Dylan's.
they're Canadian.
Oh, of course they are. Yeah,
Sorry to
yeah,
be pedantic.
you're
Sorry,
right.
USA.
But I can't. Well, they might count as American soon, so
Oh, good
Yes.
point. Good
that's
point.
True.
there you are.
Mm. We'll
Creedence
have to
Clear
include bands from Greenland as well.
and probably the UK. Creedence Clearwater Revival. I had Blondie on there as well. I can't actually. Dispels the myth that I only like bands pre '93. I nearly went for the White Stripes, but I thought they're too. They're a niche
Yeah.
act. I'd quite like them, and I had a phase I quite like the Fleet Foxes, but they're very quirky, sort of indie group.
Mm.
But Zappa as well. So I could have had a second list out of this
I was
one,
going to say,
but
you're going to list every American band ever. We've only got limited time.
Pre-93.
393.
All right, good. Peter, what about your also rans?
I've got a few. Cold War Kids, sort of 2000 onwards, really eclectic, weird indie group. Love them though. I think they're great. Jefferson Airplane, I think has a few good songs, and I just like the way they seem to have no control over their output. I don't know how they write. It's just bizarre, but I really like that kind of West Coast scene. That's why I've also put in the Turtles. I think Eleanor is a great song. I love some of that. They really learned, didn't they, from the sort of Beach Boys how to write, I think. And then you've got bands like The Association, I really like, and some of the Monterey pop stuff. It really comes across in there. It's a great film, well worth watching if you haven't seen it. And I also put Guns N' Roses as well, because they were incredible live. Their early gigs are just amazing, and they absolutely triumphed against all adversity to get what they wanted, and they were huge. But not a band I listen to that much, but they are sensational when you see them live.
Right, yes. Appetite for Destruction is a brilliant album, isn't it?
Yeah.
No question. Um, all right, good. I've got the Monkees. They could have almost made it on, I think. People laugh about them, but they were like proper musicians and a proper band, and they got some of the original stuff, as Sean pointed out, was really good, I think. I got Jefferson Airplane, but I'm not a huge Airplane
No.
fan. I like Surrealistic Pillow as an album, but apart from that, I can take or leave their albums, really. Um, I've got Buffalo Springfield, yes. Kings of Leon,
Mm.
of a more modern set, new millennium, I suppose. But I couldn't really put them on because I don't think they're anywhere like as good as anywhere near as good as the Strokes or the
Yeah.
Killers. And I don't enjoy many of their albums actually, but apart with the possible exception of the first one.
Mm.
Um, Also, I mean, the Supremes. We didn't really do a
Yeah,
lot of like singing bands. I think that's the thing because these girl groups, they're sort of more performers, aren't they, than writers? And I think writing is like a big thing for us, really.
yeah.
Because we're obsessives. um, and yeah, Sly and the Family Stone. I'm not a huge fan of them, but I think they're a very important band. And I've got the Jimi Hendrix Experience because you wouldn't let me put that on my UK list, so I thought, well, I'll put it on the American list. But it didn't even make it. I know I had two English guys in. I mean, my thesis is always that the Experience was basically an English band, and Jimi Hendrix made his
Mm,
name in England, and recorded
yeah.
in England and everything. But I think Sean's sort of substitution of Band of Gypsies was probably a wise choice
Mm.
under the circumstances. Now, in that case, let's go to, without further ado, our number one. Sean, what's it to be?
Just going to drop this. It's the Beach Boys. And
Right.
if you want to hear anything about the Beach Boys, go to our podcast.
Yeah.
Um, Blooming great band. And I think, uh, as good as it gets, as good as the Beatles in certain periods, and I don't say that lightly, but I'm just going to park it there and let you guys chew on it.
That's what you call a mixed metaphor there, I think. Park it there and you can chew on it. Um, Peter?
Yeah, so for me, it's the Geno Washington band. No, it's the Beach Boys. Basically, they are untouchable, aren't they? There's something so original about them. They just don't seem to they don't seem to have come from anything in particular. They just sort of are brilliantly there. And this is pre-Beatles as well. I mean, their earlier stuff isn't even influenced by any English bands, is it? It just seems to rise from something. And all the other bands we know are sort of post-Beatles, really, aren't they? Unless they're rock and roll. Unless they're rock and roll acts, which are all solo acts, basically. The Beach Boys are just out on their own, cannot be touched for like the futuristic way they see songwriting is just amazing. The key changes, which just seem to come so naturally to Brian Wilson, that just seem to be like completely off this planet, just bizarre. I mean, I really like, the Smile album, the original Smile album. It's so eclectic. It works so brilliantly. I know that not everyone's a big fan of it, but really influential, just the way in which Brian Wilson thinks, and this sort of push off between the two, transatlantic thing. However, they did not try to be the Beatles. This is the thing. So many bands on stateside saw the Beatles, and it was like a starting gun, for everything else. It's a rediscovery of their own past. The way bands can work. It's something, but the Beach Boys actually sort of predate that slightly. They're not. They might be influenced by them, but that's not why they started. They just you just come from somewhere else, which is brilliant. I just think I commend them as my number one. And Tim, I'm fascinated to hear what you think number one is.
Well, yeah, I get the last word, don't I? Unfortunately, but
Yeah.
yes, it's the Beach Boys. I mean, isn't this fascinating? Because we've had three almost completely different lists, and yet
Mm,
suddenly, right at the end, I mean, almost completely different, but like right at the end, we're all saying the Beach Boys number one.
mm,
Yeah, I mean, what can I add? I think that they're the American Beatles, but in a way, they're better than the Beatles, aren't they? I mean, that's what's really interesting about them. Well, let's start with the comparison. I think that, like the Beatles, the Beach Boys take a simple, somewhat boring art form and they make it into something completely universal, right? Also, like the Beatles, um, they bring the avant-garde into the mainstream, which is something that you forget, about them. And their weirdness has been alluded to on more than one occasion. Me and Sean were discussing it only the other day, um, and as Peter was saying, they've got one of the greatest composers. I mean, that's the word, isn't it, of the 20th century in Brian Wilson. I mean, the music just pours out of him. Uh, and Peter was talking about like his way of thinking. I mean, it's does he think? I mean, have you heard him speak? It's like he's not. It's almost like he's not thinking at all, isn't it? Except something's going on in there.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you want a definition of a genius, I mean he's it, isn't he? You know, even his recent solo albums are great. Like they just there's got so many great songs on them. You know, um, I think the only person that's perhaps comparable to him is again to return to the same theme as before is Paul McCartney, perhaps. You know, Paul McCartney wrote Yesterday, right?
Mm.
Which is one of the greatest popular songs ever written. But could McCartney have written "Surfs Up"? I'm not sure that he could have. You know, so I think they could be a candidate for the greatest band of all time in any country, the Beach Boys. But you know, we'll
When
see what the audience have to say about that.
when you discuss the weirdness, I think that was I could have well contributed to that because he is unusual, isn't he? And McCartney's more once you get in once he sort of gets into his flow, you kind of understand what he's doing. He's sort of this instinctive writer, isn't he? And you can imagine songs kind of starting and just pouring out. Whereas Brian Wilson, they're so some of the ideas are so odd. It's
Mm.
just the way he thinks is just completely different, isn't it? You
Yeah.
just haven't heard anything like the way he
Mm.
writes.
That's right, and it's bordering on madness, isn't it? But I
Yeah,
mean, it's a kind of madness that we cherish because it enriches our culture, collectively so much.
yeah.
Sean, Is there anything you finally wanted to add?
I don't think I can add any more to what you've said, really. Just
Mm.
funny, they were a band that I came to fairly late, I would say. Always liked them, but I sort of had a more of a Damascus Road conversion,
Mm.
probably around 1993, I think
Yeah.
it was. But I've not stopped listening to them since, really. And not everything. I think we discussed not everything they did was great because obviously, there's been so many trials and tribulations, and what band can sustain a 30 foot or 40 year career, but certainly, the build up to Pet Sounds, and I like that period where, well, it's awful to say, isn't it? But Brian's struggles with his mental illness and so on. And that sort of period where they're trying to deal with the fallout, and you've got all the shrapnel of all these bits of Smile landing on various albums, and Carl has to sort of come up a level, with some of his songs. I love stuff like Trader and Feel Flows and stuff like that. He had such a great voice, Carl
Oh
Wilson.
yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely amazing.
He's I think in a way, Sean, the price you pay is the possibility of absolute failure, isn't it? When you're sort of living on the edge, which Brian Wilson was, wasn't it? Everything was just kind of manageable with such a great mind behind it that you're always in danger of falling flat on your face, aren't you? But that's the price you pay for being so creative and coming up with such unusual ideas, isn't it? It could all fall flat on its face. I mean, it's just waiting to happen all the time, isn't it?
Yeah. All
Well,
right. Well,
I
wonderful. I
think
mean, I think that's probably perhaps a good place to leave it. So those are our top tens, but what are yours? Please let us know in the comments. We'd be delighted to chat with you on the subject. Um, that applies to both to the YouTube and the podcast versions. Okay, so we'll see you on the next episode of Crapper. Sean, would you like to say goodbye?
here we go.
Peter?
See you soon, folks.
And it's goodbye from me. See you on the next Crapper. Ta-ra!
Bye.